Day 60 of class, where we'll address issues such as why are penguins stupid, evolutionarily, and why do sponges have different types of cells. Now, what you'll need for this lesson, of course, would be GR40, which you would have done before this class, and then you'll need GR41 and the tissue identification worksheet and Chapter 53 scar sheet. That would be due next class and be worked on in this class. If we look at our ETD, which you should write down now, why are penguins stupid, evolutionarily? Because they are stupid creatures. I mean, who wears a tuxedo every single day and waddles around and is a bird who can't even fly? And then why do sponges have different types of cells? Go ahead and write down the questions, take a swing at them, and then we'll come back to answer those questions together in time warp right now. If we look at penguins, why are they stupid? Well, one thing we can notice, of course, is that they don't have to be very intelligent to survive, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what penguins evolutionarily are stupid for. Penguins are vertebrates. Being vertebrates, they are descended, as all vertebrates are, from their fish ancestors. Having that bony backbone to protect things like their spinal cord gave them a huge advantage, and a group of them developed their pectoral fins and their pelvic fins to become these bony limbs. And those bony limbs of things like lungfish, which were able to capture some air, keep it moist, and derive oxygen from it, eventually evolved by mistakes into these things called amphibians. The amphibians tend to have 4 limbs. They're a tetrapod. They can move on to land because they can support their mass on that land, but they're still tied to the water because they have simple fish-like eggs. They have to stay moist or they dry out. So anytime they breed, like in the spring, they come back, you hear the frogs calling because they're all returning back to their fishy ancestry of laying their eggs in the water. Eventually, mistakes occurred that allowed them to develop more keratin. And those amphibians broke away from the water and became reptiles. Keratin scales gave them a water-type barrier, as well as the evolution of this wonderful thing called the amniotic egg. The multiple membranes inside the egg allow the embryo to stay moist, but still get rid of things like nitrogenous waste, get oxygen to the embryo, and keep it alive, so that finally a vertebrate could break its tie to the water. That then developed into a special group of reptiles that were really good at living on dry places. They're called dinosaurs. Dinosaurs branched into many different groups, but one group of them, the raptor group, was highly successful, had some interesting bone structures in their hip that gave them great flexibility. They also evolved things like feathers. And one of their greatest traits was this stuff called uric acid. Uric acid allowed them to, of course, travel onto land and survive in dry conditions. But all of these creatures are likely, before the raptors, ectotherms, meaning that they are controlling their temperature by the outside. The environment decides their temperature. We would say that they're cold-blooded creatures. So if it's cold out, they're moving slow. If it's warm out, they're moving fast, or they're hiding from overheating. It's likely that at the time of the dinosaurs, those dinosaurs evolved into a different branch called the endotherms, where they started to control their own temperature. And the best evidence comes from the fact that they eventually evolved into a branch known as the birds. And they likely flying birds evolved from these because their feathers are seen in the fossil remains that we find in China. Those flying birds had some advantages. One, they had uric acid, but they still had a reptilian egg. And uric acid is much, much lighter and easier to transport. You don't have to get rid of a bunch of water to get rid of your nitrogenous waste, and you're lightweight. If you ever watch a bird take flight, the first thing that it will do is it will take a poop right before it leaves. And it's a white and black poop. That white stuff is uric acid. It's much, much lighter, and if they dump it off, they can be even lighter, allowing them to escape things like predation by flying into the sky. Now, they also evolved no teeth, which allowed them to be even lighter. This horny beak, which we see in some dinosaur groups, gave a lightweight structure with lots of strength and reduced weight so that flight became eventually possible. But their uric acid ancestors were the dinosaurs, and we still see them plopping on our cars today. Now, eventually, a group of these flying birds, who are nice endotherms, they're highly energetic creatures, they have to eat to supply the energy to run their cells, they evolved into these really stupid birds known as penguins. Now, I say that they're stupid because they gave up something I would love to have, which is flight. They became, of course, non-flying, flightless birds that became swimming birds. So if we look at this, they're not only swimming birds, they spend their day eating, of course, things in the sea. They eat mainly fish and krill. And that means that what they've basically done is they've done an evolutionary full circle, which to me is stupid. They just spent, hundreds of millions of years evolving first legs onto land, then the ability to live on land permanently, then feathers so they could fly, take to the air, and then give it up to become basically a thing that lives like a fish eating fish. Now that to me seems evolutionarily stupid because it's a waste of a lot of time, but it's not necessarily a stupid choice because there is a cost to flight. Penguins live in a place where there are no land predators, so they don't need to fly to survive. Without the need to fly, flying is highly expensive, so giving up flight saves energy. So, evolutionarily, of course, this isn't stupid, this is genius. Being able to save energy and not expend it on a flight that you don't need means you can spend more of your energy on things like making babies. And making babies and having those babies have a greater chance of survival is what evolution cares about. So today, penguins have lost the ability to fly like other flightless birds, but they also are being ectotherms. They can save energy within themselves by insulating themselves with their feathers. Less flight means more energy to do other processes, right? This, of course, is not just the story of penguins. This is the story of the evolution of vertebrates, especially the bird group, which you likely need to know for the AP exam. If we take another branch off that, we can see that these tetrapod reptiles evolved into another group that use amniotic eggs, but its scales developed into long filaments, and those long filaments, of course, became what we call hairs. The first group of those would be things like the monotremes. These are the egg-laying mammals that we find in Australia today and New Guinea, things like echidnas or platypi, right? A group of them eventually evolved into a group that left their egg inside of them longer and developed inside their womb, and they became what are known as the marsupials, and other wings called the eutherian mammals. First, the marsupials developed a simplified form of pouch outside of them, a purse, a marsupium, and then eutherian mammals kept their baby inside of them for even longer so they could steal nutrients from the mommy longer, have a greater chance of survival. So we can see in this story that, of course, these fishy ancestors that gave rise to all vertebrates took many different branches, but eventually all of them developed the insulation that would allow them to save energy inside their body. And saving energy is the name of the game in life. Now, if we look at penguins, penguins are stupid intellectually. They don't have to be smart because they don't solve a lot of complex problems like we do, but they do solve problems in their environment, and they're geniuses of survival. They live in one of the coldest places on Earth, and they still do fly. They just fly in a different fluid. They fly underwater, and they can rocket through the water. If you look at them, they have this counter shading, which allows them, of course, to be camouflaged from predators in the water. And they still face a major predator. That's why they have to be fast, and why being endothermic is such an advantage, because they can keep up their metabolism and fly through the water at incredible speeds, because around there is the other group of endotherms, the mammals. Now, mammals didn't make it on land in Antarctica, but leopard seals did, and their main prey is penguins. So, being a warm-blooded endothermic mammal allows them to generate their own metabolism, but also means that they're always hungry. This, of course, allows them to predate on fast things like penguins, so the evolutionary race always continues to go. Right? If we look at the other part of this, it's saying, why do sponges have different types of cells? Now, when we see Spongebob, I actually think of Spongebob as a beautiful thing. He is Uncle Bob. And Uncle Bob is the ancestor of all animals. And like all animals, he is multicellular, and he has specialized cells. There are certain cells inside of called choanocytes. They're the collar cells. They generate the current that draws water through the edge of the sponge and allows it to come up through the channel, creating a large influx of water and any of the living things that they might want to feed on, like phytoplankton and zooplankton. Their job is mainly to create current and to collect food. Then inside of it, there's also amoebocytes, and being amoebo-like cells, they're very good at doing phagocytosis, absorbing it. Each of them specializes in their own task, which gives them some huge advantage. If they become specialized cells, then they have some cells that do different tasks. You'll have some cells that are there for structure. You'll have others that help it to digest, others that help it to absorb, and others that help it to defend. Now, the cool thing is, if one cell gets really good in its structure at doing a certain job, then that means other cells don't have to do it because they can cooperate together. That means there's no redundant jobs. You're good at creating current. You don't have to be good at, say, secreting or excreting nitrogenous waste. By having no redundant jobs and having each cell specialized, that means that less energy is used by each cell. And if you save energy, that means you can increase your survival and increase your reproduction because you can spend more energy on, say, making gametes or something like that. Now, that's why, of course, animals and other multicellular creatures like plants have been successful. They have a collection of specialized cells. And if you got an issue, that's why you have tissues. And tissues are that collection that can increase the efficiency of a multicellular creature and allow them to, of course, dedicate tissues to solving issues in their life. If we look at the sponges themselves, they've got these wonderful choanocytes, and there's the amoebocytes. You can see them creating current. They are the simplest of all animals because they're multicellular and they're heterotrophic. But being multicellular also means that they are not colonial. They have specialized cells that are doing specialized jobs, the definition of an animal. Now, right now you would get together with Buddy, you would look at the big ideas of GR40 for part 1 of GR40 anyway. What essentially you should notice is that in part 1, it's really about form and function. And with that form and function, that means that it's anatomy. Form is your anatomy, the structure of your body, and function is physiology. It's how those body parts function to come together to do their job. So this is the start of our anatomy and physiology unit, but really you should see it as a form and function unit that's getting you ready for your AP. If we know the forms, we can figure out their function. If we know the anatomy, we can figure out their physiology. What we would do today in our class, of course, is look at the structure and function of one of the weirdest creatures on Earth, humans. And this will be our look at human anatomy and physiology, first lesson of that. As we dig in that today, our goal is to figure out the hierarchy of body plans and the cells to body systems idea for living things, and the structure and function of 4 different tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. If we look at the hierarchy levels, we can see that the smallest building block of all living things that's alive is the cells. Those cells come together, and different specialized cells can build a tissue. That tissue can then collect together, such as muscular tissue, to contract, and then collect enough of those tissues together, you can get an organ. And if you have an organ like the heart, then that organ can become part of an organ system, such as the cardiovascular system, which that then combines with other organ systems to create an organism. All animals are composed of specialized cells. They have organized tissues, and each tissue performs a different function to overall increase the efficiency of the whole organism. What we would traditionally do now is we would go in and take a look at a bunch of slides. You guys would create a SCAR poster that would look at the form and function of all these different types of cell types. Now, one of the things that you would notice, of course, is you can look at a cell type and you can figure out its form, and that will tell you its function. So if we look at these cells right here, this is muscular tissue, and this looks right here like this is smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue is made of a bunch of different types of muscle cells that contract involuntarily. We can see they have lines of actin and myosin fibers that allow them to get shorter. In this part right here, we can see this is what's called pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. And we can see that it's pseudostratified because it has weird looking layers, pseudostratified. It's columnar because they're showing up in columns. And one of the things that we'll find is it's an epithelium. So it's a thin layer, and its main job is to create, of course, surface area. This is one like we would find in places like our small intestine, where you can see there are a whole bunch of these little tiny microvilli. Each of those microvilli increase the surface area, thereby increasing the ability of this cell to absorb more and more nutrients from something like your small intestine. What we're going to play now is a game called Name That Tissue and Function. And if we look at these tissues that are right here, we can see that by their shape, they tell you what they are. They look like little cubes. They're in thin layers. So this is what's known as simple cuboidal epithelium. It's a skin layer, but this can be in the inside of your body too. Now, if we look at its main job, these cuboidal cells have a lot of surface area, so we find them in places like our ovaries or our nephrons, or we can find them in things like our the glands of our endocrine system. They're good at secreting, and they're also good at, of course, absorbing. So one of the jobs of them is to make sure they can get things in and out of our body, such as in the thyroid gland. They can produce stuff into our blood. If we look at epithelial tissue, it covers the outside, or what's the inside outside of our body, such as our digestive tract or our blood vessels, right? And they are named by their shape. There's the cuboidal that are shaped like cubes, dice. There's columnar, which look like columns, and there's squamous meaning flat, like floor tiles. If we look at their arrangement, they tend to be in single cell layers. They could be stratified, where they have multiple layers, strata, or they can be pseudostratified in varying different combinations of their shapes. If we look at the shapes, there's the cubes, good for things like digestion and secretion. There's the columnar, which is also good for absorption. There's the pseudostratified, good for absorption. We could look at things like the tissue of the esophagus, where we have thin layers that aren't made for absorbing, they're just for covering a certain area. Or we could look at things like the lung, where they're extremely thin, simple squamous epithelium that allows the absorption of things like oxygen and the excretion of things like CO2. If we play another name, the tissue, you can see that this one, well, these are weird cells. They have no nuclei because most of those are erythrocytes. They're red blood cells. And then this one right here, you can see it has a nucleus, and that, of course, is a leukocyte, a white blood cell. Their differing jobs have to do with their shape, their form, and their function. The erythrocytes are red because they carry more hemoglobin, so they're good for conducting oxygen throughout the body or carrying it throughout the body. And then leukocytes, which means white cells, are, of course, your police force that work in your immune system to protect you. They all belong in, strangely, a thing called connective tissue because of this one certain protein called collagen. If you increase the amount of collagen or decrease it, you can change which connective tissue you are. Loose connective tissues have less of that binding collagen, so they have more flexibility, like you can feel in your cheek and skin. Increase it greatly and you get the cartilage, the hard stuff that's inside your ear or your nose or your joints. And that's why if you want to eat some Jell-O, you're basically eating cow joints or cow fingernails. You have an increased amount of collagen and a little bit of keratin. If you want to have fibrous connective tissue, such as tendons and ligaments, you increase it so that you have a strong structure that you can hopefully not snap. Then adipose tissue, of course, has little goblets that you can store things like fatty acids inside of them. They can swell. The blood, of course, doesn't seem like a connective tissue until we realize that you get a cut. And when you get that cut, things like fibrinogen and collagen can build up to build the scar tissue that will then connect it. Or your white blood cells can attack something by surrounding it with collagen fibers and then doing phagocytosis. And then there's bone. If we dissolve away the bone itself, we find that there's a protein complex that holds the bone together in its place and gives it structural strength. The connective tissue that's in here, you can see, fits into many different graphics of the book, and just changing the amount of collagen will decide, of course, its form and function. If we think about connective tissues and collagenous fibers, they give that strength and flexibility. As you get older, like I am, of course, you can tell because my skin is getting wrinkled. I'm getting less able to repair and replace my collagen fibers, whereas your skin is young and springy, but your time will come too. The cells that lay down that stuff are called fibroblasts. And anytime that we see the term blast attached to a cell, it's going to be one that, of course, is good at laying down either proteins or it's good at laying down additional cells, go through mitosis. Macrophages, of course, are part of the immune system. They're the big eaters that are going to use their collagen components to grab onto and envelop different invaders. If we name that tissue again, you can see that these things have lines or strata. Hey, that's stratified, and they're long columns, but there are nuclei. This is definitely striated skeletal muscles. This is a voluntary muscle. Muscle, of course, has a main job. It can contract and get shorter, or it can relax and get longer. You can find this in things like your biceps, your triceps, your quads, right? If we look at the three different types, there's skeletal muscle, which is voluntary, right? Attached to your skeleton. There's smooth muscle, which is involuntary, such as your digestive tract or your lungs. And then we can see things like the cardiac muscle, which have their own individual beautiful structure where they kind of go in different shapes and create a wonderful net bag, a muscle bag. And the neat thing about your cardiac muscle cells is they're connected by these things called intercalated discs, where they can actually send different amounts of calcium to the ones next to them and cause the whole thing to contract, so they don't need your nervous system to do it. So we can actually take out and do the Indiana Jones where your heart continues to beat outside of your chest because they tell each other to beat. And they're in a net-like shape, so the blood stays in there. Skeletal muscle is much more columnar in its shape, and that's because its job is simply to get shorter or relax and get longer. It can contract and bring a limb towards you, or it can relax and let that limb go away. Then smooth muscle has less of those fibers because it's not involved in such violent movements. Instead, it involves itself in a process called peristalsis, where it can slowly move through waves of contractions through your stomach and into your the rest of your digestive tract to flow that food through you. And as it does that, of course, those wave-like patterns you can hear as it gurgles inside your stomach because your stomach has a little bit of fluid inside of it and, of course, gas, and that's a sign that your stomach is empty. So that gurgling of your stomach when you're hungry is smooth muscle doing its work. If we look at these cells, you can see these cells are very different. They have nuclei, but they have a whole bunch of little antennae, and they kind of look like aliens. And those antennae, of course, are connecting because those are dendrites and exons. And these are motor neurons. Their job is to make connections and to send chemoelectric signals through their synapses. When they do that, they're sending those signals to each other or connecting from the brain to the spinal cord to all your limbs and other tissues, basically directing them to change their behavior. The neurons themselves, of course, are highly sensitive cells, but they're often supported by other cells like glial cells, which feed them with nutrients or oxygen. Because if they're so active to actually send their signals, they're going to burn through energy quickly. So they need to be babied quite a bit. That's why you wear a helmet or you protect your neck and try not to snap these things because they don't grow back so well. Their main job, of course, is to transmit signals and respond in stimuli in our environment. That's why they have those dendrites and the axons to pick up signals and to send messages to the next nerve cell. They're all about connectivity. So if we look at GR40, the first part of it's talking about there's different tissues. Each has a different structure, which determines their different functions. If you look at the shape of them, you can figure out what they're going to do. And the four main tissue categories that we have are, well, we're going to run into them. They're the epithelial, the thin ones, good for absorbing, covering, or, of course, releasing nutrients. There's the connective, which have that magical thing, collagen, that ties them together, but they include things like your immune system, your blood, your bones. They give you flexibility and immune response. The muscles, which are all about contracting and relaxing, changing the motion of objects and their placement on your body, and the nerves, which are all about making connections through those synapses. Your homework for tonight would be GR41, tissue identification sheet. You'd be able to do if you did the lab. Chapter 53 as you dig more into the ecology on your own. And of course, you should be working on the 2012 FRQs to help get yourself ready for the exam.